So what if the biggest country in South America spoke English? It's a wild thought, right? Today, we're jumping into this really fascinating what-if scenario, a world where Brazil wasn't colonized by Portugal, but by Great Britain. And believe me, the changes would go way beyond just the language. We're talking about a total reshaping of culture, politics, and the entire identity of the nation. Okay, let's get into it.
Just try to imagine it. The music, the books, the day-to-day conversations of more than 200 million people, all happening in English. I mean, that alone is a massive shift, but honestly, it's just the very, very tip of the iceberg.
And yeah, what about the cities themselves? You know, British colonization left a pretty specific architectural stamp all over the world. How would that style look, painted onto the already vibrant canvas of Brazil? It's kind of fun to think about.
And this is where we get into the really deep structural stuff. We're talking about a completely different government, a different kind of economy, a totally different path of development. So the big question is, how could this alternate reality have even happened in the first place?
Well, this whole scenario is actually way more plausible than you might think. We don't need to rewrite entire centuries of history. All it takes is tweaking one single key moment back in the Age of Discovery.
I mean, just think about that chaotic scramble for the New World. It could have been as simple as a British ship landing first, or maybe a shift in European power dynamics. If Portugal got distracted by a war back home at just the wrong moment, that huge, valuable coastline of Brazil was totally up for grabs by the next big naval power, and that could have easily been England.
And you really have to understand this to see how different things could be. In our actual timeline, Brazil's colonial experience was super unique. For a while, the Portuguese court literally moved to Rio, making it the center of the entire Portuguese Empire. This inversion is the complete opposite of how most colonies worked, and it's the baseline that our alternate history is about to just shatter.
Okay, so let's start with the stuff you'd notice right away. What would this new British Brazil actually feel like for the people who live there?
The switch to English, it's so much more than just a translation. It would completely reshape Brazil's cultural output, its relationship with all its Spanish-speaking neighbors, and its very idea of itself on the world stage.
Right, and this slide basically shows the institutional DNA that the British tended to implant wherever they went. Politically, you'd see the seeds of a parliament planted early on. Religiously, we'd probably be looking at a Protestant majority instead of a Catholic one. And economically, you'd see the rise of a powerful merchant class totally focused on trade with the empire, which would create a very different kind of society.
And this just illustrates that cultural shift perfectly. I mean, the incredible, world-famous sounds of samba and bossa nova, they were born from that specific mix of Portuguese and African cultures. In a British Brazil, they might never have existed. Instead, you might be hearing something way closer to the calypso of Trinidad or the reggae of Jamaica, styles born from the cultural blending that happened inside the British Empire.
All right, let's dig a bit deeper into the economy, because this is where the consequences of British rule get even more profound and a lot more complex.
Now, let's be super clear about this. All colonialism is built on taking stuff. The main goal, like the definition says, was to funnel resources back to the mother country with as little investment as possible. But the methods and, crucially, the timelines the British used for this would have been very different from Portugal's. And this, right here on this timeline, is maybe the single biggest difference. In a British Brazil, slavery would have been abolished more than 50 years earlier. Just let that sink in. A 50-year head start. That would have completely changed the nation's demographic, economic, and social path, with ripple effects on racial inequality that would still be felt today. It's staggering.
You know, the British Empire, for all its massive faults, was an incredible machine built for commerce. And that meant a huge focus on infrastructure, especially railways, to get resources out of the ground and to a port as efficiently as possible. A British Brazil would have likely seen this network built way, way earlier, which could have jump-started industrialization and connected its vast interior to global markets much sooner than in our timeline. So, with a different culture and a different economy chugging along, what would the actual physical and political landscape look like? I mean, how would this new nation actually be run? Well, the very look and feel of the cities would be transformed. Instead of those beautiful Baroque churches and colonial squares you see from Portuguese design, you'd probably be looking at grand neoclassical parliament buildings and big Anglican cathedrals, the kind of thing you see in other British colonial capitals.
And this brings us to another key concept, settler colonialism. See, in places like Canada or Australia, the British didn't just take resources. They tried to build institutions that were mirror images of the ones back home, at least for the European settlers. And that model would have huge implications for how Brazil was governed.
Which leads us to this really stark contrast. Brazil today is a presidential republic, but a British Brazil, it almost certainly would have become a parliamentary system, maybe even a constitutional monarchy in the Commonwealth, kind of like Canada, with a prime minister running the show instead of a president.
Now we have to remember, of course, that alternate history isn't destiny. This British model wouldn't have just been a simple copy and paste job. You'd have indigenous resistance, the sheer massive geography of the Amazon, and a million other local factors that would have shaped this new Brazil in ways we can't even predict.
And let's be absolutely clear on this point. This is not an exercise in picking a better colonizer. Both empires were built on violence, on exploitation, and on the subjugation of indigenous and African peoples. The whole point of this explainer is to understand different historical paths, not to endorse any form of colonialism.
So what's the real value of a thought experiment like this? Well, it tells us a lot about our own world. By just swapping out one colonial power for another, we can see so clearly how deeply history shapes everything we just take for granted, from the language we speak to the governments we live under.
The Brazil we know and love today is the product of a very specific, unique chain of events. If you change just one of those early links, you don't just get a different chapter, you get an entirely new book. It's just a powerful reminder of how one little fork in the historical road can totally transform the entire story of a nation.